The story began in the middle of a devastating war, where the battlefield was covered with countless dead bodies. At the heart of the chaos, a man coughed up blood after suffering a strike that should have killed him instantly. The sacred sword of the knightly order had pierced straight through his chest. Seeing the feared enemy finally fall, the soldiers burst into celebration. Their cheers carried the relief of men who believed they had at last defeated a living nightmare. The man lying in the dirt was none other than Ashiman, the infamous demon of the continent and the most powerful necromancer the world had ever known. As death slowly approached, Ashiman realized that his time had finally run out. For 10 long years, war had consumed every corner of the continent. He had prepared countless defenses for this final battle, yet all of his magic had failed in the end. Glancing at the pile of skulls beside him, he accepted this as his perfect defeat. The one responsible stood before him, the lone knight, Berkelheinen. However, Berkel refused to take all the credit for the victory. In a heavy voice, he explained that countless people had fought and sacrificed their lives just so his sword could reach Ashiman. The knight begged the archmage to surrender for the sake of peace and the innocent people suffering from the war. Those words only enraged Ashiman further. He screamed at Berkel to shut his mouth. Filled with hatred, he accused the knights of doing nothing, while a terrible plague slaughtered innocent civilians. To him, those so-called holy warriors were worse than beasts. He finished by calling every one of them pathetic hypocrites. Suddenly, a sickly green aura began radiating from Ashiman's body as he forced himself back onto his feet. The soldiers stared in horror, unable to believe he could still use necromancy even after his heart had been destroyed. His allies shouted warnings, fearing what he might do next. But Berkel calmly ordered him to stop. He reminded Ashiman of the terrible cost of the war. 20 million people had died, only to be resurrected as mindless puppets in the Necromancer's undead army. Ashiman merely mocked the knight for his foolishness. Then Berkel accused him of being driven solely by revenge for his fallen people. The Necromancer challenged him to deny it, and for a brief moment, Berkel fell silent. Finally, the knight revealed the true reason he had fought through the battlefield to reach him. Staring directly into Ashiman's eyes, his sword began shining with brilliant light. Berkel declared that every sacrifice and every battle had been for the future of the children. Those words froze Ashiman completely. The knight spoke of creating a future filled with hope for the next generation, and in that instant, something inside Ashiman shattered. Reflected in Berkel's eyes, he saw his own twisted and corrupted self. But deeper than that, he saw the man he once used to be a knight with pure ideals and a strong sense of justice, completely different from the monster he had become. As Berkel prepared to deliver the final strike for the sake of future generations, Ashiman's strength disappeared. Shock overwhelmed him, and he collapsed onto his knees in the dirt. The knight raised his glowing sword high above his head, ready to end the reign of the demon of the continent once and for all. But just as Berkel stepped forward, he suddenly stumbled. His soldiers gasped in alarm at the unexpected mistake. In that tiny opening, Ashiman grabbed a dark sword covered in pulsing runes and gave his executioner one final taunt. With a bloody smile, he asked Berkel if he had any last words. Ashiman declared that killing someone like him would never be so simple. Even while drowning in his own blood, the Necromancer still had one final move prepared. Without warning, a violent wave of dark energy exploded from his body and rushed toward Berkel with terrifying force. The magical pressure hurled the knight backward as Ashiman's eyes blazed with mysterious power. Raising his blade high into the air, the Necromancer prepared one last act of revenge against the world. A blinding flash swallowed the battlefield. When the dust finally settled, the soldiers began cheering once again, believing the enemy had at last been defeated. Lying broken on the ground, Ashiman heard the horrifying crack of his own neck. As the sounds of victory slowly faded away, his consciousness began slipping into darkness. His vision blurred, and the final thing he saw was the silhouette of someone standing over him. And so, the 10-year war that had devastated the continent finally came to an end. This marked the death of Ashiman, the feared demon of the continent. Yet, at what should have been his final moment, something impossible happened. The scene suddenly shifted to a massive and luxurious mansion on a stormy night. Inside the mansion, two maids buzzed with excitement after noticing the young master's lips twitch for the very first time. Confused by the warmth around him and the unfamiliar surroundings, the mage wondered what had happened to him. He had been reborn as a baby named Clemens, with no understanding of where he was or how he had arrived there. One of the maids showed him a portrait of a duchess, explaining that the woman was his mother. As she encouraged him to speak, the infant's tiny body trembled with effort. Gathering every ounce of strength he could, the little boy tried desperately to force out words. The maid stared in amazement, believing the gifted child was about to say his first sentence. In reality, however, he was attempting to summon his dark servants and command them to obey him. He screamed at them to protect him, but to the women, it sounded like nothing more than the frightened cries of a baby. At that exact moment, lightning split the sky apart. A brilliant white flash illuminated the silhouette of a dark knight, and the entire mansion was swallowed in light. 15 years passed in the blink of an eye. The fountain in the mansion garden sparkled beneath the warm afternoon sunlight while a group of noble young ladies stood nearby, watching someone with expressions full of admiration and surprise. A young man walked calmly across the estate grounds, his posture graceful and confident. The girls whispered among themselves, completely captivated by his handsome face and flowing white hair. The transformation was astonishing. Clemens had grown into an unbelievably beautiful young man, with snow-white hair and features so flawless that he looked as though the gods themselves had sculpted him by hand. The girls sighed dreamily, praising how dazzling young Master Clemens had become. One of them even wondered aloud what kind of divine food someone would need to eat in order to look so perfect. Their admiration was interrupted when a man entered the garden carrying a heavy bucket. Without warning, he splashed Clemens with holy water while shouting for the evil spirit inside him to leave its vessel immediately. The man was Priest Garrison, who had believed from the very beginning that something was terribly wrong with the young master. Pointing accusingly at the three nearby girls, Garrison claimed they had already fallen under Clemens's evil influence. Soaked from head to toe and completely unbothered, Clemens asked if the priest ever became tired of repeating the same purification ritual over and over again. Garrison stubbornly insisted that the soul of the Archmage Asherman lived inside the boy's body. Even though Clemens denied being a necromancer, the priest caught sight of his cold expression and immediately threw another bucket of holy water at him. As Clemens walked away, he quietly muttered that the priest might actually be insane, calling him a psychopath under his breath. Unfortunately, Garrison heard the insult. Enraged, the priest ordered his men to seize the boy and drag him away, declaring that a bath in boiling water would teach him proper manners. While being dragged off, Clemens reflected on the day of his death. He remembered his execution clearly, followed by the strange sensation of awakening inside a baby's body. Because the first words he spoke had been a dark necromantic chant, everyone immediately labeled him a demon from birth. It was during that vulnerable time that he first met Priest Garrison of the Holy Order. Clemens still remembered the enormous silhouette of the priest looming over him. That meeting marked the start of 15 years of absolute suffering. His childhood had been filled with endless 24-hour prayer sessions, freezing baths in garlic-infused water, and horrifying purification ceremonies where he was tied to a cross for public display. Under the excuse of holy rituals, he had endured every kind of torture imaginable. Now, 15 years later, Clemens sat at his own celebration party with an expression filled with boredom and disgust. His personal maid, Erin, prayed sincerely that he would grow into a heroic figure worthy of admiration, but Clemens looked like he would rather be anywhere else. Finally, losing patience with the overly religious atmosphere, he stood up and threw his party hat across the room. Erin looked devastated, sadly explaining that she had made the hat herself with all her effort and care. Feeling guilty for upsetting her, Clemens went to pick the hat back up and apologized. However, the guilt disappeared instantly when Erin revealed that Priest Garrison had actually been the one who made it. Clemens froze, his face twisted into complete horror and disgust. At that exact moment, Garrison suddenly appeared behind him and loudly called out his name. The priest looked deeply touched, nearly moved to tears by the fact that Clemens had supposedly worn the hat for an entire week. In response, Clemens calmly threw the hat onto the floor and crushed it beneath his foot. Smiling coldly, he declared that he would never wear such garbage again. Garrison exploded with rage, shouting that the evil spirit of Asherman had finally exposed its true nature. Before the argument could grow worse, the atmosphere in the garden shifted instantly with the arrival of Commander Dunnell. Stepping forward, the commander remarked that rumors about Clemens being Asherman's reincarnation had circulated for more than a decade. He reminded Garrison that the Holy Order itself had officially concluded that there was nothing unusual about the child. Hearing this, Garrison immediately loosened his grip on Clemens and respectfully agreed with the commander's statement. As Clemens climbed back to his feet, he realized something important. The priest ignored everyone else's opinions, yet obeyed Commander Dunnell without hesitation. It was then that Clemens understood the truth. Garrison was not merely a religious fanatic. He was a cunning man who understood politics perfectly. As the priest prepared to leave, he stopped at the doorway and turned back with one final warning. He reminded everyone that unexpected things could still happen in the future. After delivering that ominous statement, Garrison cheerfully bid them farewell, only to suddenly poke his head back into the room and remind Clemens that his next purification ritual was scheduled for Friday. Clemens watched Priest Garrison wave goodbye, his blood boiling with silent fury as he muttered curses through clenched teeth. Once he was finally alone, the young man slammed his fist into the sofa, unable to contain his frustration any longer. He could not understand how someone who had spent years torturing a child could still be worshipped as a holy priest. Aaron carefully approached him with a towel in hand and softly asked the question that had troubled her for years. Was he truly no longer the Archmage? Clemens denied it immediately with all his heart, swearing that he never wanted to hear the name Ashimon ever again for as long as he lived. Yet deep inside, his thoughts remained full of secrets. He knew the truth could never be revealed to anyone. Ever since his reincarnation, he had lived like a prisoner inside a golden cage. Because of the rumors surrounding him, he had constantly been watched and monitored. At one point, he had even been locked away inside a monastery for 7 miserable years. Trying to change the subject, Clemens asked about the title of executor, wondering whether it was an important rank within the Holy Order. The man beside him answered with a serious expression, explaining that an executor was considered the strongest warrior in the entire order. The revelation genuinely surprised Clemens. According to the man, almost nobody in the world could stand against an executor, except for the Duke of House Heinen, Clemens' own noble family. Impressed by the overwhelming strength of his bloodline, Clemens clapped excitedly and asked who was regarded as the strongest duke in the family's history. The man explained that although the current 7th Duke Clemens' father was extremely powerful, the first Duke remained unmatched. That answer shocked Clemens. He had assumed the current generation represented the peak of the family's strength, but the man firmly insisted that the founder of the house was in a league of his own. Seeing the young master's intense curiosity, the servant simply agreed with him to keep him satisfied. At that moment, Aaron noticed that Clemens had become completely fixated on a portrait hanging in the Grand Hall. Commander Dunnell quietly reflected on the strange irony of fate. No one could ever have predicted such a twist. 200 years had passed since the founding of House Heinen, yet Clemens still struggled to comprehend the absurd reality of his current life. His eyes slowly moved across the portraits of his ancestors before finally stopping on the very first Duke, the strongest of them all. There, framed in gold and staring back with unwavering eyes filled with justice, stood the founder of the Heinen family, Berkel Heinen himself. The necromancer Ashimon had not merely been reborn. He had been reincarnated as the direct descendant of the very man who had killed him. Even now, the echo of his final screams still lingered in his memory. He remembered cursing Berkel's name with his dying breath. He also remembered the knight's noble declaration that every sacrifice had been for the future of the children. With that final devastating strike, the feared necromancer had fallen into the freezing snow, utterly defeated and broken. Suddenly, Clemens jolted awake in his luxurious bedroom, breathing heavily as he struggled to calm himself. He cursed the nightmare of his previous life. Centuries ago, he had been a monster powerful enough to plunge the continent into ruin, only to be slain by a hero and reborn 200 years later into an entirely different life. Running a hand through his snow-white hair, he muttered bitterly to himself, unable to reconcile his current elegant appearance with the terrifying monster he once was. The silence in the room was suddenly broken by a chilling voice from the doorway. Mockingly, Priest Garrison commented that the young master had been talking in his sleep again. Standing there with a sinister grin, the priest questioned him about those suspicious dreams, causing Clemens to hurriedly come up with an excuse about being exhausted. Before he could recover, his red-haired maid Erin burst into the room in complete panic. She explained that she had overheard his dark muttering during sleep and immediately began imitating the ominous things he had been saying. Panicking, Clemens rushed toward her and desperately tried to silence her before the situation became even worse. Unfortunately, it was already too late. The head butler entered the room to announce that the family's sword exhibition was about to begin. After hearing about Clemens's strange behavior, Garrison coldly declared that the boy's purification rituals would now be doubled. Covering Aaron's mouth with his hand, Clemens trembled with suppressed anger and disbelief at how unfair his life had become. As they headed toward the courtyard, he mentally cursed Priest Garrison with every insult he could think of, convinced the man was completely insane. Curious about the upcoming event, Clemens asked the servants about the sword exhibition. The butler explained that the Duke himself had personally ordered Clemens to attend the ceremony. Surprised by the sudden attention from his father, Clemens accepted a handkerchief from a young maid. The mustached butler immediately scolded the girl for bothering the young master, but Clemens stepped in to defend her. He even handed her a biscuit, sending the maid into pure happiness as she happily munched on it. As Clemens looked out across the magnificent estate, he wondered why his father had suddenly summoned him. Then the butler revealed the real reason. Members of the family's secondary branch had arrived for a visit. Clemens's expression darkened instantly. He already knew exactly what kind of irritating political drama awaited him. The moment he stepped into the grand hall, the noble relatives gathered around him with mocking smiles and malicious eyes. Without hesitation, they began taunting him by repeatedly using the name of the ancient villain, hoping to provoke a reaction from him. The relatives laughed among themselves, loudly reminding everyone that the demon child had spent 7 miserable years trapped inside a monastery. Clemens observed them with cold, calculating eyes. He quickly identified the overweight noble from the northern branch, who had obviously only come to the gathering for free food and luxury. His attention then shifted toward a blonde girl whose posture radiated unbearable arrogance. She was another member of the side branch who looked more than ready to turn the family gathering into a battlefield of insults. The girl from the western branch carried herself with icy superiority, staring at everyone around her as though they were beneath her. Ignoring all the mockery and petty insults, the main heir calmly walked straight past the group, leaving them irritated behind him. One of the cousins finally snapped in frustration. His face twisted with anger as he shouted, asking whether that piece of trash truly intended to ignore them inside his own home. The arrogant noble continued yelling, but the former archmage found it almost amusing that these branch family members behaved as if they owned the estate themselves. With a freezing stare, Clemens calmly stated that people like them were not even worth remembering by name. Deep down, he thought with disappointment that the main family must truly be declining if side branches had become bold enough to act so disrespectfully within the household. Suddenly, everyone's attention shifted toward the arena, where two young swordsmen were engaged in a fierce sparring match. A purple-haired boy lunged forward recklessly, pouring all his nervous energy into a desperate attack. However, the pressure quickly overwhelmed him. Unable to withstand the counterattack, he lost balance and crashed onto the ground in defeat. Burning with humiliation, the purple-haired youth angrily demanded that his opponent stop holding back and fight seriously. Standing above him was a calm, golden-haired boy who effortlessly blocked the incoming attacks with graceful precision. A confident smile rested on his face as he casually declared that the match had already been decided. This young prodigy was Dalton Rhineland, Clemens' older half-brother. The overwhelming aura surrounding Dalton made it obvious to everyone that he was the true pride of the family and the one carrying its prestigious reputation forward. Clemens carefully observed the duel as his eyes faintly glowed purple. Activating his magical sight, he began analyzing every detail of their abilities. Driven by desperation, the defeated opponent charged forward once more, swearing that things would end differently this time. Dalton moved instantly, his sword becoming little more than a blur. While his opponent desperately tried to counterattack, Dalton maintained complete control of the battle. He smoothly avoided every strike and effortlessly slipped past a powerful downward slash. Suddenly, brilliant golden energy surrounded Dalton's body. His movements accelerated beyond what ordinary eyes could follow as he prepared to unleash a special sword technique. Clemens watched closely, analyzing every tiny detail: Dalton's footwork, shifts in balance, and the exact instant he pushed forward using the tip of his toe to generate explosive speed. Blinded by frustration, the purple-haired rival attempted one final strike aimed directly at Dalton's face. Through his magical vision, Clemens could even see the hidden flow of mana within the family's secret sword art. In the next instant, Dalton unleashed a devastating blow, the famous meteor sword technique, striking his opponent directly. The judge immediately ended the match and declared Dalton the winner. Remaining polite and composed, the blonde prodigy smiled gently and remarked that his opponent would have suffered serious injuries if he had attacked with full force. As the guests whispered in amazement over such a high-level technique, Clemens realized the entire performance had been a calculated warning aimed at the secondary family branches. Soon after, Dalton noticed his younger brother standing nearby and approached him with a playful grin. He asked how long Clemens had been watching and jokingly claimed he would have performed even better if he had known his younger brother was present. Looking at Dalton's flawless swordsmanship and fake kindness, the former archmage felt genuine disgust. At the same time, he wondered about the true purpose behind gathering all the branch families together. The atmosphere in the grand hall suddenly changed the moment the 7th Duke of House Heinen entered. Clemens felt immediate tension as his father approached, and the entire room fell into heavy silence. The Duke first gave a rare nod of approval to his eldest son, acknowledging the tremendous effort Dalton had invested to achieve such mastery with the sword. Watching the interaction with cynical eyes, Clemens realized that Dalton was the sole source of pride for both the Duke and the entire family. Commander Dunel added that Dalton's control over the blade was extraordinary for someone his age. Maintaining his humble facade, Dalton bowed respectfully and claimed he still had much to learn. As the Duke walked past, he briefly spoke about the heroic legacy carried by their bloodline, causing Dalton to bow once again with deep respect. Then the Duke's eyes shifted toward Clemens. His gaze was cold, sharp, and filled with undisguised contempt. Without speaking a single affectionate word, the Duke stared silently at the silver-haired boy, making his disappointment painfully obvious. Then, to the shock of everyone present, the Duke placed a hand on Clemens's head and coldly declared that he could not sense even the slightest trace of mana within him. Lowering his head quietly, Clemens apologized, fully aware that in this world, a noble born without mana was considered practically worthless. At that moment, Commander Dunel stepped forward to defend him. He suggested that the years Clemens had spent isolated in the monastery had likely slowed his growth and development, but the damage had already been done. The surrounding nobles immediately began whispering among themselves, mocking the heir who possessed no mana at all. The nobles whispered among themselves, claiming that if the main bloodline had become this weak and useless, then it was time for the branch families to take control. As Clemens walked through the long hallways, he tried to convince himself that he could tolerate all the insults directed at him. But then Berkel Heinen's famous words about protecting the future resurfaced in his mind. Clenching his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white, he felt a wave of fury rise inside him. The former archmage found it painfully ironic that he had lost his life to a legendary hero whose descendants had now become such pathetic trash. Even as the guests began leaving, the ridicule continued. Zoltan, the purple-haired youth from one of the branch families, stepped directly into Clemens's path and mocked him openly. He sneered, asking how a noble heir could be so incompetent that he did not even know how to properly wield a sword. The arrogant boy continued insulting him, calling Clemens a disgrace to the Heinen family name. Outwardly calm, Clemens looked at Zoltan and immediately judged him for what he truly was, a worthless busybody with no real talent. When Zoltan angrily raised his fists, Clemens casually remarked that he was both naive and unbelievably stupid. The insult enraged Zoltan. He stomped forward violently, preparing to attack. But in a single swift movement, Clemens swept his legs out from under him, sending the loudmouth crashing face first onto the hard stone floor. Blood dripped from Zoltan's nose as he lay there in shock while Clemens coldly advised him not to vent his frustrations on other people. Humiliated and desperate, Zoltan screamed one final insult, calling the silver-haired boy a motherless bastard. The moment those words left his mouth, Clemens slowly turned his head. His eyes glowed with terrifying, predatory fury. Seeing that demonic expression, Zoltan froze instantly. His face turned pale as cold sweat covered his skin, genuine fear overtaking him completely. The former villain reflected bitterly that the true corruption within the family was the disgusting superiority complex carried by fools like Zoltan. As traces of ancient magic slowly stirred within his veins, the reincarnated Necromancer wondered how much longer he would need to continue pretending to be weak. It was difficult for him to witness how far the clan had fallen. Remembering the radiant and heroic figure of Berkel Heinen, the man who had once defeated him, Clemens could not help but feel pity for the miserable state of the hero's descendants. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Commander Dunel. The commander's powerful voice echoed through the corridor as he ordered the injured Zoltan to stop causing such a pathetic scene. Standing firm like iron, the knight made it clear that he would no longer tolerate such disrespect while under his watch. Zoltan gritted his teeth in silent frustration, lacking the courage to argue with someone as powerful as the commander. As he retreated, he threw one final mocking remark over his shoulder, telling Clemens that he should feel grateful for having such a protective bodyguard. The coward quickly limped away in an awkward hopping run, leaving Commander Dunel staring after him in confusion. Resting his hand on the hilt of his sword, the knight assured Clemens that the area was secure once more. The silver-haired boy silently observed the commander for a moment before finally breaking the silence. Calmly, he asked whether the knight had a spare sword he could borrow. Later that night, the two traveled deep into a dark forest covered in thick, swirling mist. Eventually stopping, Commander Dunel handed a heavy steel sword to the boy. The commander questioned why the young master needed a weapon at such a late hour, but Clemens said nothing. Instead, he gripped the sword firmly and assumed a combat stance identical to the one Dalton had used earlier. Watching this, the commander assumed the boy was merely clinging desperately to the dream of becoming a swordsman. Deep inside, the knight felt pity for him. Without mana, all effort was meaningless. A person born without magical power could never hope to become a true knight of the Empire. Unaware of the commander's thoughts, Clemens began swinging the sword through the damp night air. Even though he supposedly lacked the ability to use the family's secret techniques, he focused entirely on his training. Closing his eyes, the former archmage replayed the arena battle perfectly within his memory. With astonishing precision, he began recreating the exact footwork Dalton had used earlier that day. His movements were impossibly refined for someone his age. With flawless timing, Clemens synchronized every motion perfectly, reproducing the genius sword technique with complete accuracy. Suddenly, a dangerous purple aura began swirling around the blade. As he recreated the sword's trajectory with terrifying perfection, purple sparks hissed and crackled violently around his glowing eye. Sensing the sudden change in the atmosphere, Commander Dunel immediately turned around, his breath catching in shock. He stood frozen, unable to comprehend the overwhelming aura of power radiating from the boy he had always believed to be weak. In the next instant, a colossal wave of jagged purple energy exploded forward toward a massive boulder. But just as the attack reached its peak, a sharp flash tore through Clemens's pupil, disrupting the flow of power. The dark aura shattered apart and dissolved into the freezing night wind. Even so, the gigantic boulder was sliced perfectly in half, the surface of the cut still faintly glowing. Commander Dunnell stood speechless, his entire understanding of reality collapsing before his eyes. Slowly turning around, Clemens tightened his grip on the sword as a surprised yet satisfied smile formed on his lips. At last, the ancient power he once possessed had finally begun responding to him again. He had truly succeeded. Clemens had reproduced the powerful sword technique with terrifying precision. Nearby, the young maid Erin stood completely frozen in shock. Her jaw hung open as she struggled to process the impossible scene she had just witnessed. Commander Dunnell was not handling it much better. A single drop of sweat rolled down his temple as he stared at the split boulder, his mind shaken by the realization that the supposedly manaless boy was far from ordinary. The next morning arrived abruptly, with Clemens currently having his head shoved deep inside a bucket of water. Standing nearby, the commander casually remarked that the young master could now apparently hold his breath for more than a full minute. Gasping loudly as he pulled his head back out, Clemens was forced to endure the knight's dry jokes about his aquarium training. He angrily shouted at the commander, who simply laughed in response. However, the knight's expression soon sharpened as he admitted that he had sensed a distinctly sinister aura coming from Clemens's room earlier that morning. As Erin carefully dried the silver-haired boy's damp hair, a servant entered carrying a sealed envelope with formal posture. The messenger informed Clemens that Dalton had sent him a personal invitation. For a moment, Clemens blanked on the name before the servant reminded him that it was supposedly an apology invitation from the Branch family boy. Immediately recalling Dalton's pathetic attempt at attacking him, the former archmage scoffed internally. He knew someone like that had no intention of sincerely apologizing. As he opened the letter, his suspicions only grew stronger. Inside was an invitation to participate in a hunting competition. To Clemens, the entire setup practically screamed trap. It was obvious that his enemy simply wanted an excuse to lure him far away from the safety of the manor and into the wilderness. When the messenger asked for his response, Clemens looked up with a sharp glint in his eyes and calmly stated that he saw no reason to refuse. After all, he now possessed an overwhelming advantage. His gaze drifted toward the sword resting nearby, and he realized that all the time he had spent obsessively analyzing Dellen's movements had awakened a terrifying new talent. He could perfectly copy any technique after witnessing it only once. Commander Dunnell began preparing the carriage for the hunt, insisting that he would personally accompany the young master to guarantee his safety. Eyeing Clemens suspiciously, the commander asked what kind of scheme he was planning this time. With a serious expression, Clemens reminded him about their previous conversation regarding the strange changes in his power. The knight admitted that something truly felt different today. A dark and ominous pressure lingered in the air around them as the carriage rattled along the rough road toward the distant estate. The journey through the forest proved rough and uneven, causing the carriage to shake violently as it traveled deeper into the woods. Inside the cramped carriage, poor Erin had turned pale green from motion sickness, clutching her stomach miserably. Eventually, she collapsed weakly against Commander Dunnell, who sighed and muttered that he had warned her not to come in the first place before offering her a pillow to rest on. Meanwhile, Clemens gazed quietly through the carriage window at the endless forest outside. The commander explained that the terrain in these woods was always difficult for newcomers to endure and encouraged Erin to simply sleep through the trip. The knight was secretly touched by what he assumed was the young master's kindness, only for Clemens to bluntly clarify that the pillow was solely for Erin's comfort and not meant for the commander. Falling silent afterward, the silver-haired boy continued, staring out at the passing trees with a distant expression. As he observed the ancient forest, he reflected on how drastically the world had changed over the past 2 centuries. 200 years ago, this very land had looked entirely different. What was now a vibrant and thriving forest had once been a frozen wasteland buried beneath snow, death, and endless corpses. The former villain looked upon the transformed world with quiet contemplation. For the first time, he felt a small amount of reluctant respect toward Burkle Heinen, realizing that the hero had truly succeeded in turning that graveyard into a better world. His thoughts were interrupted when a guard suddenly opened the carriage door and announced their arrival at the Corwell family estate. Stepping onto the gravel path, Clemens looked up at the massive manor and was surprised to find it even more luxurious than his own ducal residence. Dryly, he remarked that the hosts possessed an absurd amount of wealth for what was supposedly just a children's hunting competition. Suddenly, a familiar, irritating voice called out his name from across the courtyard. Dalton approached with a sneer, surrounded by several lean and restless hunting dogs. Mockingly, he asked what the silver-haired trash was staring at. Laughing arrogantly, he boasted that the extravagant estate had been built using wealth drained directly from Clemens's own family. Beside him, one of the enormous hounds let out a low growl, saliva dripping from its mouth. Noticing how disturbingly skinny the dogs appeared, Clemens flatly asked when the competition would actually begin. Zoltan casually waved off the question and told him to pay attention. Then, in a display of deliberate cruelty, he released the starving hunting dogs into the forest. He explained that bait had been hidden throughout the mountain to attract wild animals. Proudly, he bragged that a starving dog's sense of smell was thousands of times stronger than a human's. As the desperate hounds sprinted through the woods in search of food, Zoltan calmly raised his bow. Driven by hunger, one of the dogs charged toward the bait with its jaws wide open only to be struck down by Zoltan's arrows the instant it arrived. The animal cried out in agony while Zoltan laughed at the brutal spectacle with twisted amusement. Horrified by the cruel and pointless violence, little Erin stepped forward to defend her young master. However, Zoltan only sneered at her, recognizing her as the annoying girl who always followed Clemens around. Pretending to act friendly, he reached out as though he intended to pat her on the head. But his expression quickly twisted into something dark and unsettling as he mockingly asked what a useless girl like her could possibly contribute. Without warning, he grabbed Erin's arm roughly and yanked her toward him with enough force to leave bruises. Before he could do anything further, Clemens suddenly seized Zoltan's wrist with an iron grip. His eyes burned with cold, predatory fury as he warned the boy to remove his hands immediately or he would break his arm on the spot. Shocked by the overwhelming strength in Clemens's grip, Zoltan panicked and threw a desperate punch toward his face. But Clemens effortlessly dodged the attack with a slight tilt of his head. Trying to hide his fear behind arrogance, Zoltan quickly jumped onto his horse and challenged Clemens to follow him deeper into the hunt. Without hesitation, Clemens mounted his own horse and instructed Commander Dunnell to remain behind and protect Erin, assuring him that he would return soon. The commander, however, refused to simply stay behind without preparation. Pulling out a magical scroll tucked into his belt, he explained that it was a signaling charm activated by tearing it apart. Since the item required no mana to use, it would allow him to rush to Clemens's aid immediately if danger arose. Clemens gave a firm nod. He already suspected that Zoltan's father was involved in something suspicious. If he disappeared into the forest, then this was clearly far more than a simple hunting game. The situation had become dangerous. Before riding off, Clemens looked back at the commander with eyes far too serious for someone his age and instructed him to tear the scroll the moment things became problematic. He calmly promised that if that happened, a great storm would rise in his hand. The cryptic statement left Commander Dunnell silently watching as the young master disappeared into the darkness of the forest. Time passed, and night eventually covered the woods in silver moonlight and tangled shadows. Riding deeper into the forest, the former archmage quietly reasoned that Zoltan could not have hidden very far away. Eventually, Clemens entered a clearing and finally found him. Zoltan stood waiting like a twisted figure in the middle of a massacre. The ground around him was covered with the corpses of slaughtered animals, their blood soaking into the earth. With a mocking sneer, the purple-haired boy asked why the great heir had taken so long to arrive. Slowly dismounting from his horse, Clemens silently examined the gruesome scene before him. The dead hunting dogs were scattered around Zoltan like grotesque decorations. A manic grin spread across Zoltan's face as he rose to his feet and proudly announced that they had finally reached the grand finale of the competition. Drawing his sword, he revealed his true intentions. Clemens himself was the final prey. Zoltan threatened to kill him and later deliver the tragic news of his accidental death to his older sister like some kind of trophy. Laughing maliciously, he mocked the Heinen family, calling their bloodline a pathetic joke. Then he gave a signal. Instantly, hooded figures emerged from the darkness like ghosts, surrounding Clemens with drawn bows aimed directly at him. The assassins coldly remarked that the young master had simply been unfortunate enough to be born into the wrong family at the wrong time. Despite the deadly ambush, the silver-haired boy remained perfectly calm. He merely observed the situation with detached boredom. Zoltan continued boasting arrogantly, claiming that by tomorrow the entire continent would be gossiping about the collapse of the legendary sword family. According to him, Clemens's body would become nothing more than food for forest scavengers. Facing certain death, Clemens suddenly found himself remembering Berkel Heinen's irritating speeches about protecting the future. A small mocking smile formed on his lips. The sight confused and irritated Zoltan. Then, to everyone's horror, Clemens suddenly began laughing. It was not the laugh of a normal child. The deep, hysterical cackling that echoed through the forest sounded ancient, terrifying, and completely unnatural coming from someone so young. Zoltan instinctively stepped backward, asking if the silver-haired freak had finally lost his mind. Clemens covered his face with one hand as he continued laughing uncontrollably at the absurd irony of the situation. When he finally lowered his hand, his eyes were no longer human. They glowed with a terrifying crimson light. Addressing Zoltan as a foolish brat, Clemens spoke with overwhelming authority. The purple-haired boy froze instantly. Sweat poured down his face as pure instinctive terror consumed him. Clemens coldly reminded them that the Heinen family itself had been built upon the foundation of his own death, and he would never allow insects like them to stain that legacy. Suddenly, a violent blue-black aura exploded outward from his body, causing the very ground beneath them to tremble. Terrified, Dalton screamed that Clemens must be using hidden magic. But Clemens only smiled wickedly and corrected him. This was not magic. It was pure demonic energy, the raw power once wielded by the ancient Necromancer himself. The assassins panicked immediately. Their weapons shook violently as they realized they might have cornered something far worse than a helpless noble child. Suspended in the air by dark power alone, Clemens reached into the depths of forgotten history and called upon ancient evil spirits to rise once again in his name. Dark energy twisted violently through the forest as the former archmage commanded his creations to devour everything before them. From the shadows, a gigantic skeleton slowly emerged, its colossal body towering over the battlefield. Clemens pointed toward his enemies and ordered the undead creature to consume them all. Dalton screamed in absolute terror as he recognized the horrifying undead army from the ancient legends surrounding Asura, the feared demon king. With a chilling smile, Clemens sealed their fate with a single gesture. But he had endured 200 long and torturous years in complete isolation, buried beneath a mountain of bones and skulls. Every day had blended into an endless nightmare of darkness, where the only thing he could sense was the constant whisper of the dead calling to him from the depths of the abyss. That haunting resonance was something he could never escape. It served as the only reminder of who he truly was. Back in the present, the atmosphere turned suffocating as enormous black clouds swallowed the moonlight overhead. Dalton continued screaming that this couldn't possibly be real, repeatedly shouting the forbidden name of the Archmage in sheer terror. Clayne only smirked, calmly admitting that it was indeed the very name that once made the world tremble in fear. The mercenaries, who had initially frozen in shock, began whispering among themselves, wondering if the legends of the Demon King had actually been true all along. Before them stood gigantic skeletons whose hollow eye sockets suddenly burst into an intense blood-red glow, piercing through the darkness. Even so, the mercenaries quickly regained their confidence and broke into mocking laughter. They insulted the skeletons, bragging that they had destroyed hundreds of undead creatures before. One mercenary even laughed about taking a bone home as a trophy, while their leader shouted for everyone to clear the path and kill the silver-haired boy standing calmly at the center of the storm. One man stepped forward, lifting an enormous crossbow and aiming it directly at the young mage. At the command to fire, countless arrows and bolts screamed through the air, streaking across the night sky toward Clayne and his undead army. The deadly barrage closed in at terrifying speed, the sharp projectiles reflecting in Clayne's eyes as they rushed toward him. But the moment the arrows should have pierced their targets, the entire volley stopped in midair, as though it had slammed into an invisible barrier. Dalton shouted victoriously, convinced the enemy had been riddled with arrows. However, his excitement vanished the instant the dust cleared. Standing before him completely unharmed were the skeletons, protected by massive spectral shields that had appeared out of nowhere and blocked every single projectile. The undead army remained motionless and flawless, an unbreakable wall of bone and magic ready to transform the hunters into the hunted. Heavy shields now rested in the skeletons' hands, prepared to withstand any further attack. Clayne stared at his enemies with a mix of pity and contempt. He remarked that 200 years was more than enough time for the world to forget the true horror of his army. The mercenaries fell into panic as they watched shields materialize from thin air within the monster's bony grasp. In a calm yet chilling voice, Clayne explained that ordinary skeletons might indeed be weak, but his undead soldiers were forged from an entirely different class of power. With a sharp and confident smile, he declared that his army was unlike anything they had ever encountered before. That statement, combined with the boy's complete composure, pushed Dalton deeper into absolute terror. Clayne then coldly issued an order to his first unit. Break their formation. Advance. He swore that anyone who dared mock the future of the North would be crushed by his own hands. With those final words, he unleashed his forces. The giant skeletons charged across the battlefield with shocking speed, moving far faster than their massive skeletal frames should have allowed. The mercenaries stared in disbelief, unable to understand how piles of bone could move with such deadly agility. Then, with a silent and terrifying battle cry that echoed directly into the minds of the living, the undead army descended upon them. The mercenary captain screamed for his men to stand their ground and suppress their fear, but his voice was drowned out by the sounds of slaughter. One of his men was smashed aside by a skeleton's brutal strike, his broken body sent flying through the air. The massacre had truly begun. The forest echoed with the screams of dying men and the relentless clattering of bone. Dalton watched in horror as the battlefield transformed into a slaughterhouse created by his own arrogance. Without hesitation, the young archmage gave another command to his second unit, ordering the crossbowmen to eliminate the enemies hiding among the twisted branches of the surrounding trees. The skeletal archers immediately shifted positions, their hollow eyes locking onto their targets with unnatural precision. The surviving mercenaries felt terror consume them as they realized the undead possessed deadly long-range attacks as well. With a cold and emotionless command, Clemens ordered them to fire without mercy. A storm of lethal arrows tore through the darkness at incredible speed. Mercenaries were struck down instantly, the sheer force of the bolts pinning them to the ground as they screamed in agony. One particularly tough mercenary leader attempted to fight back, blocking the heavy strike of a skeleton with his sword. Desperate and terrified, he shouted that such a thing should be impossible, that no ordinary necromancer could control undead with such terrifying coordination. At that moment, he realized the horrifying truth. If the battle continued, every single one of them would be completely annihilated. Dalton, watching everything collapse around him, desperately screamed for his men to listen to him, but his words vanished beneath the chaos and bloodshed. Suddenly, a skeleton appeared behind him, raising its jagged blade for a fatal strike. Fueled by panic and rage, the purple-haired noble spun around and delivered a powerful slash that cleanly severed the skeleton's skull. For a brief moment, Dalton rejoiced, believing he had finally discovered the monster's weakness. But his victory instantly turned into terror. The headless skeleton did not collapse. Instead, the body continued moving forward as though nothing had happened, swinging its weapon at him with relentless force. Dalton stumbled back in horror, finally realizing that the laws of life and death no longer applied to the creations of the Archmage. Frozen in absolute disbelief, his mind screamed that a mere skeleton should never have been able to move without its skull. With a slow and mocking smile, the protagonist reminded Dalton that he had already warned him. As the headless skeleton rose once again, it casually bent down, picked up its severed skull from the ground, and reattached it to its neck as though it were simply adjusting a piece of armor. Clemens calmly explained that this terrifying resilience was the very reason he had once conquered the entire continent in his previous life. Watching the creature repair itself with its own hands pushed Dalton into absolute primal terror. The former Archmage then revealed a horrifying truth. Spirits summoned through pure demonic power do not follow the normal laws of mortal injury. They are not beings that die easily. The remaining mercenaries were driven to the edge of madness, crying out in despair as they realized they were battling an army that simply refused to stay dead. Clemens let out a faint sigh, remarking that his current youthful body could only sustain 11 elite summons at once. Then, with chilling calmness, he asked the trembling survivors whether they truly wished to continue this meaningless farce. As blood continued to stain the forest floor, the scene suddenly shifted back to the peaceful mansion gardens, where the commander and the little maid, Erin, were laughing together beside a fountain. Erin giggled as she imagined stories about the young master's supposed mischief at the monastery. The commander observed her with softened eyes, noticing how deeply she genuinely adored the boy. With her cheeks stuffed full of snacks, she nodded excitedly and declared that she loved him more than anything in the world. She then asked the knight if he truly understood just how incredible the young master was, describing him as kindness incarnate. Her innocent praise created a haunting contrast with the reality unfolding elsewhere. While she called him gentle, a terrified mercenary was sprinting through the dark forest, screaming in fear. While she described him as sweet, a skeleton cleaved through a henchman with a blade infused with dark magic. And while she smiled brightly and insisted he was the warmest person alive because he shared his biscuits with her, a freezing aura of death was suffocating all life within the forest. Back amid the slaughter, the protagonist's eyes remained as cold as shards of ice, utterly devoid of the warmth Erin believed he possessed. One mercenary released a final choking scream before a skeleton finished him off, leaving only the purple-haired Dalton still desperately fighting. He panted heavily, his entire body trembling with exhaustion as he wildly swung his sword. Though he managed to land a powerful strike, the skeleton's shattered bones instantly reformed, driving him deeper into hopeless despair. Consumed by desperation, Dalton finally realized attacking the undead directly was pointless. The only way to end the nightmare was to kill the puppeteer controlling them. If he could kill the young master, the summons would disappear. Roaring in hatred, Dalton charged straight toward Clemens while screaming his name. He declared that this macabre game of manipulating corpses would end here and now, and that everything would be settled with the mage's death. Raising his sword high overhead, he poured every last ounce of strength into a final executioner's strike. But Clemens did not even flinch. A brilliant purple light suddenly ignited within his eyes as his magical perception calculated the attack's trajectory with crystal-clear precision. To the ancient necromancer, Dalton's desperate assault appeared painfully slow, nothing more than the pitiful struggle of a child foolish enough to challenge the ruler of death itself. Purple energy crackled violently within Clayton's gaze, illuminating the darkness as he tracked every tiny movement of his opponent. At that moment, the memories buried deep within his mind resurfaced. He perfectly recalled a sword technique he had witnessed only once before, the exact rhythm and movement his brother had displayed in the arena days earlier. Dalton's eyes widened in horror the instant he recognized the stance. It was the sacred secret art of the Heinen family. Clayton unleashed the devastating meteor sword technique. His blade transformed into a streak of descending light that collided directly against Dalton's weapon. A sharp metallic crack echoed through the battlefield as Dalton's sword shattered in half, the broken steel spinning helplessly into the dirt. Standing above his trembling opponent, Clayton lowered his voice into a freezing whisper and informed him that his true punishment had only just begun. As the battle slowly came to an end and the night air turned eerily silent, Clayton looked down upon the defeated noble and admitted that Dalton had been correct about one thing. If a summoner dies, his creations lose their power. Even the great Ashaman had never succeeded in overcoming that weakness. However, the former archmage reflected upon the irony of his current existence. In his previous life, he had relied entirely on demonic energy, but now the martial strength of the Heinen bloodline compensated for his former weakness. The blood of his ancient enemy now flowed through his veins, transforming him into something far more dangerous than he had ever been before. Broken and confused, Dalton tried to speak, but his limbs no longer responded. His body felt unbearably heavy against the ground. Clayton met his gaze with absolute indifference and overwhelming contempt as the light slowly faded from Dalton's eyes. With his final breath, Dalton collapsed. Clayton then turned his gaze toward the distant horizon and softly whispered to the spirit of Burkle that he should wait, because he intended to rebuild the ruined house with his own hands. Suddenly, Dalton jolted awake. But the forest had vanished. He suddenly found himself trapped within an overwhelming darkness so dense it felt impossible to breathe. He tried moving his arms, only to realize they were tightly restrained by heavy iron shackles that bit painfully into his skin. Panic surged through him when he discovered he had been chained to a torture chair covered in cruel spikes and rusted chains. From the endless void, a shadowy figure slowly stepped forward, dryly remarking that the guest had finally awakened. It was Clayton, though in this strange realm he appeared far more terrifying. He calmly explained that this was the place where souls were dragged after death, a personal afterlife created by the will of Ashaman himself. Dalton's mind nearly shattered at the realization. He was dead. He had become trapped within a dimension crafted by the Necromancer. Clayton leaned closer, his voice carrying the weight of centuries as he reminded Dalton about his favorite pastime, the countless dogs he had tortured, starved, and slaughtered purely for amusement, all while hiding behind the excuse of noble tradition. The mage recalled the twisted delight Dalton used to display during those hunts, and that very memory had now become the blueprint for his punishment. Dalton screamed and demanded to be freed, but his desperate cries vanished into the abyss. Then a horrifying realization struck him. He remembered Clayton's sword piercing through his body. Yet despite that, he still appeared physically unharmed. Clayton calmly explained the nightmare. Dalton truly was dead. The body he currently possessed was nothing more than a vessel created to endure the weight of his karma. Whether he believed in souls or the afterlife no longer mattered. The debt had come due, and the time had finally arrived for him to pay for every drop of blood he had spilled throughout his life. His sins had returned to collect their price. Dalton's breathing turned into broken sobs as ghostly hounds slowly emerged from the darkness behind Clayton. The Necromancer ordered him to listen carefully, truly listen to the chorus of barking and snarling belonging to the lives he had cruelly ended for entertainment. The spectral dogs lunged forward. Their phantom jaws tore directly into Dalton's soul, and he released screams filled with unimaginable despair, as though his very existence were being ripped apart. The silver-haired mage stood above him coldly and told him to remember this agony forever, because this hell was one Dalton had personally created with his own cruelty. Dalton begged desperately for mercy, but no compassion answered him as the spirits of his victims continued tearing him apart. Back in the physical world, Dalton's lifeless corpse lay collapsed on the ground, covered in wounds that mirrored the torture occurring within his soul. Clayton slowly sheathed his sword, his expression calm and emotionless after eliminating the fool who had dared humiliate him. Behind him stood his skeletal army in complete silence, loyal and unmoving. As he gazed into the hollow eye sockets of his undead servants, Clayton felt a faint sense of ancient obligation. He quietly told them they deserved a reward for answering his call after so many centuries, promising that one day he would free them from the curse of eternal servitude. A brilliant emerald light spread across the clearing, and the skeletons gradually dissolved into glowing particles of mana. Clayton watched silently as they faded into the wind, reflecting upon the endless cycle of existence. Once again, He questioned why he himself had been pulled back from death. To him, true death occurred only when bones turned to dust and vanished without a trace. Yet somehow, he had returned once more in flesh and blood. His thoughts were interrupted when a hooded figure emerged from the trees, openly expressing surprise that someone so young could wield the forbidden art of necromancy. Clemens' eyes narrowed immediately as he demanded to know who the stranger was and how much he had witnessed. The man merely responded with a cryptic smile and claimed there was no need for names. Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, a sickly green aura ignited in his palm as he began casting a spell of his own. He remarked that the boy would never understand the true scale of his mission, even if it were explained to him. Moments later, the corpses of the fallen mercenaries suddenly twitched and rose from the ground. Their eyes glowed with a dull green light as they became mindless puppets under the hooded necromancer's control. The stranger lifted the bodies effortlessly with dark magic, commenting that while Dalton himself had been a pathetic failure, the corpses he left behind were still useful. Then, with one final chilling laugh, the mysterious necromancer disappeared into the mist, taking the reanimated bodies with him. Far away at the mansion, the once peaceful atmosphere had become tense and uneasy. Arin, the young maid, continued trying to persuade the commander to listen to more stories about the young master's antics, but the knight remained silent, staring at the emergency scroll in his hand with growing concern. He could not shake the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. 3 hours had already passed since the signal was sent, and every instinct in his body warned him that it was a trap. The commander finally decided to leave the estate and search for Clemens personally, but before he could depart, 2 stern-faced castle guards stepped directly into his path. The atmosphere instantly became tense as the commander realized the conspiracy surrounding the young heir extended far beyond a simple hunting expedition. The guards coldly informed him that abandoning his post now would create serious problems. The knight fell silent, his eyes narrowing the moment he noticed the crest of the Corwell family emblazoned across their uniforms. That alone confirmed everything he needed to know. Dalton's family had planned this betrayal from the very beginning and had prepared themselves carefully for every outcome. The commander straightened himself and delivered one final warning. If they attempted to block his path again, he would no longer remain passive. The overwhelming killing intent radiating from him caused the Corwell guards to hesitate in fear. Turning toward Arin, the commander instructed the young maid to return safely to the manor alongside the priest who had accompanied them on the journey. However, one of the guards grimly informed him that the priest had already departed quite some time ago. Remembering Clemens' earlier warning and sensing the terrifying urgency of the situation, the commander immediately mounted his horse. With the emergency scroll clenched tightly between his teeth, he tore it apart, fully convinced that none of these events were mere coincidence. He kicked his horse into a full gallop, racing toward the forest as quickly as the animal could carry him, terrified of what might have already happened to his master. Deep within the dark woods, the young protagonist stood facing the mysterious necromancer's army of the dead. Sweat dripped down his pale face as he realized that most of his demonic energy had already been exhausted during the earlier battle. His youthful body had reached its limit, and he no longer possessed enough power to summon his own undead forces. Sensing victory within reach, the hooded necromancer ordered his zombies to attack the boy without mercy. The undead horde rushed forward, but Clemens merely smirked, mocking the necromancer for believing he could achieve victory simply by imitating the ancient arts of necromancy. Suddenly, the crest engraved upon the magic scroll in Clemens' hand burst forth with a blinding holy radiance. The approaching zombies screamed in agony and staggered backward as the sacred light burned through their rotting flesh and tore apart the surrounding darkness. Clemens laughed coldly and informed his enemy that he was now completely finished. The necromancer stared in confusion as the ground beneath them began glowing with divine golden energy that spread upward like a tidal wave, swallowing the shadows entirely. From within, the radiant light emerged the priest who had been traveling alongside the young heir. His eyes blazed with brilliant golden fire. In a voice that thundered across the forest, he called upon the holy light to purify the abominations standing before him. Instantly, the zombies disintegrated into drifting ashes. The priest calmly assured the young master that he could now rest easy because the church would handle everything from here onward. The stunned necromancer demanded to know who this man was, someone capable of wielding such overwhelming divine power. The priest looked at him with unwavering resolve and introduced himself as an Exark of the Holy Order. The Exarchs were known as the Church's ultimate human weapons, 3 chosen warriors sworn to carry out the absolute will of the Pope. They alone possessed the right to wield the sacred weapons left behind by Saint Galligand. Legends claim that a single Exarch possessed enough martial strength to rival an entire fortress. The necromancer trembled as the priest's holy aura physically crushed the darkness surrounding him. Clemens silently watched the man he had believed to be an ordinary priest reveal himself as the strongest martial warrior among the chosen 3. The Exarch stepped forward protectively in front of the boy and vowed to shield him from all evil. Driven by the Necromancer's desperate commands, the remaining zombies snarled and charged forward with savage fury, but they stood no chance against the overwhelming divine light. The Exarch raised his sacred tome and unleashed a blazing baptism of holy fire that incinerated the undead instantly. He commanded the sinners to repent and pray for salvation before it became too late, his voice carrying the weight of divine judgment itself. Then, with a powerful stomp of his foot, a massive shockwave of golden energy erupted through the earth. The ground shattered violently as the undead puppets were blown away like leaves caught in a storm. The Exarch declared this destruction to be an act of mercy, a final judgment delivered upon corrupted souls. The sheer pressure of the attack hurled the Necromancer backward through the air. His mind reeled in disbelief at the absurdity of an Exarch appearing in such a remote place. Cursing bitterly under his breath, he realized that his carefully prepared scheme had collided with the most terrifying weapon the Holy Order possessed. The hooded Necromancer spat angrily onto the ground, shouting that such divine power was nothing more than a grand illusion. Terrified, he turned and attempted to flee the battlefield. But in his panic, his mask slipped from his face and fell onto the forest floor, exposing his identity beneath the moonlight. He barely managed to take a few steps before the Exarch suddenly appeared directly in front of him like a divine executioner. In a frighteningly calm voice, the priest asked where exactly he thought he was going. The Necromancer screamed as the Exarch's overwhelming mental pressure invaded his mind and crushed his willpower completely. Struggling desperately for breath, the sorcerer listened as the priest softly whispered that the prayer was not over yet and that he should feel grateful for the judgment the divine light was about to deliver. Then, in the name of the Holy Order, the Exarch unleashed one final purifying strike that reduced the Necromancer to nothing but a pile of gray ash. Clemens observed the execution carefully, noticing one of the Necromancer's eyes rolling across the dirt before stopping near his feet. As he bent down to pick it up, he silently reflected upon the Exarch's terrifying efficiency. With a single step and the overwhelming pressure of his mere presence, the priest had instantly annihilated more than 20 undead bodies. Even the former Archmage found himself deeply impressed by such monstrous power. Suddenly, a blood-stained hand grabbed Clemens' shoulder with bruising force. It was the Exarch. The priest narrowed his eyes while carefully examining the boy from head to toe. He explained that he had rushed to this location the moment he sensed a massive surge of necromantic energy. But now that he stood here, something felt deeply wrong. The Exarch's grip tightened as he admitted that the aura of death he had detected did not seem to belong to the boy. Yet it had unquestionably originated from this exact location. His gaze sharpened with suspicion, and Clemens immediately felt an intense wave of tension. He understood he was standing at the edge of disaster. If he made even the slightest mistake or spoke a single wrong word, this holy warrior would kill him instantly without hesitation. The tense standoff was suddenly interrupted by the sound of thunderous hoofbeats. The commander arrived at full speed, shouting Clemens' name in panic and alarm. Seeing his guardian arrive so quickly brought a brief sense of relief to the protagonist. But the burden of the night had finally reached its limit. The strain of channeling even a fragment of his former necromantic power had pushed his young and fragile body beyond its breaking point. His legs suddenly gave out beneath him, and the world around him began to spin. The commander instantly leaped from his horse and caught his young master before he could collapse onto the ground. Filled with concern, the knight urgently asked what had happened, only for Clemens to weakly whisper that his strength had simply run out. When questioned about the fate of the hunting party, Clemens coldly confirmed that Dalton had died during the battle. Nearby, a lone white flower stained with droplets of crimson blood swayed quietly in the cold night breeze. The scene then shifted back to the mansion, where a heated investigation was already underway. News of Dalton's death had exploded like a thunderclap. Count Delon Corwell, Dalton's father, slammed both fists onto the table in blind fury. He refused to believe that his son, whom he proudly described as honorable and loyal, would ever attempt to assassinate the heir of the ducal family. An investigator interrupted him and presented official documents proving that 20 mercenaries connected to the Corwell family had been discovered at the scene. The Count's face immediately paled upon realizing his men had been exposed, but he quickly tried to construct another defense. He argued that the entire story made no sense. Dalton was a trained warrior, while everyone knew Clemens possessed no mana and lacked even the ability to defend himself properly. Desperate to preserve his reputation, the Count began attacking Clemens' character instead, bringing up the strange rumors surrounding the boy's deceased mother. He accused Clemens of secretly hiring an assassin to murder Dalton before framing him for the crime. Just as the accusations reached their peak, a powerful commanding voice suddenly echoed through the room, ordering the Count to shut his mouth. Clemens calmly entered the chamber, wearing a faint mocking smirk as he remarked that there truly seemed to be no limit to the nonsense people were willing to say. He stated clearly that he had acted purely in self-defense, and explained that the priest had assisted him against the true threat, a necromancer. When the Count furiously called him a liar, Clayne met his gaze fearlessly. A faint pink glow flickered within his eyes as a razor-thin, ironic smile spread across his face. With calm mockery, he asked whether everyone had already decided he was Ashimon reincarnated. The Count immediately felt a suffocating pressure fill the room as Clayne reminded everyone of the vow he had made after ending Dalton's life. He had sworn to rebuild the shattered Heinen family with his own hands. His voice carried an unsettling conviction as he declared that he would restore the family himself and would never allow vermin to stand in his way again. The unbearable tension inside the room was suddenly interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. A blonde woman stepped inside, and the atmosphere itself seemed to freeze around her presence. She was the commander of the Blue Spear, Holy Knights, and her arrival instantly sent waves of unease throughout the room. Clayne recognized her immediately. She had been watching from the shadows during the sword exhibition earlier. When one of the nobles questioned her authority to be present, the investigator explained that Dalton had previously carried out missions for her order, giving her a legitimate interest in uncovering the truth. The woman fixed Clayne with a sharp and analytical stare that instinctively made even the ancient mage within him cautious. Without wasting another moment, the commander requested a private conversation with the young heir. Although the investigator hesitated at first, he eventually allowed it while warning Clayne not to take too long. As Clayne followed her toward a secluded room, countless possibilities raced through his mind. He understood immediately that this was not a casual meeting. It was either a dangerous test or an attempt to confirm her suspicions. Regardless of her intentions, Clayne silently resolved to use her family, the powerful House of Fervin, as a stepping stone for his future ambitions. They eventually entered a private study, and the commander turned toward him, her calm yet strangely seductive voice breaking the silence. Without warning, she suddenly pinned him against the wall. Her eyes locked onto his as she softly whispered an unexpected request. She wanted to touch him and discover the truth for herself. This woman was the eldest daughter of the Fervin family, one of the 3 legendary pillars of the continent. Clayne vividly remembered her terrifying reputation. Historical records described how she slaughtered savage orcs on the battlefield, her glowing blue eyes shining with deadly intensity as she danced through enemy ranks with her spear. She was a living legend, a warrior who had personally annihilated high-level monster hordes while standing alone atop mountains of corpses to protect innocent civilians. Even now, in the present, that overwhelming aura surrounded her as she continued teasing him. When Clayne hesitated, she sharply told him to stop pretending they shared any real closeness. Despite their distant family ties, she reminded him that she was born from the main bloodline while he came from a separate branch family. That meant she felt absolutely no obligation to restrain her personal curiosity. The commander pushed him against the wall once more and firmly demanded to see his hands. Clayne protested in confusion, asking what exactly she was trying to do, but she ignored him completely. Taking his hand into hers, she carefully examined it with a touch that was both delicate and firm. She observed aloud that his hands were as soft as a child's and completely lacked the scars and hardened calluses expected from a true swordsman. Her fingers traced along his tendons with clinical precision as she leaned closer, her warm breath brushing against his face. Then she asked the question that truly mattered. If his hands showed no signs of swordsmanship, then what kind of power had he used to kill Dalton and 20 trained mercenaries? Clayne immediately shoved her away and retreated several steps, cold sweat forming along the back of his neck. At that moment, he realized this woman was even more dangerous than the priests. She was not searching for a confession. She was searching for a reaction. And he knew very well that in her world, even the smallest hesitation could expose everything. In her eyes, silence meant admission, and hesitation was as good as confirmation. Deciding it was better to attack first, Clayne forced a mocking smile onto his face and directly asked what she would do if he truly were the legendary Archmage Ashimon. To his complete shock, the commander suddenly burst into laughter. She looked him up and down before casually declaring that a tiny pipsqueak like him could never possibly be the terrifying demon king of legend. The insult struck Clayne harder than any blade ever could. He stood frozen in disbelief, quietly repeating the word pipsqueak to himself as the reality sank in. The most feared necromancer in history had just been called short. Still stunned, he asked if perhaps she had made some kind of mistake. But her teasing grin never changed. Without hesitation, she confirmed it again and even offered to repeat herself if necessary. Once more, she called him a pipsqueak. Clayne immediately felt his temper flare from pure humiliation. Deep down, he knew she was technically correct about his current height, but that did nothing to ease the devastating blow to his pride as the former demon king. As if that were not humiliating enough, the commander suddenly made an outrageous proposal. If he could defeat one of her knights without using either a sword or necromancy, she would give him a kiss. Clayne was left completely speechless. Between the lingering pain from his injuries and the absurdity of the situation, He struggled to process whether this was some strange political maneuver or simply an unbelievable provocation. The commander then glanced toward the horizon and calmly remarked that it was getting late and she needed to return to the meeting. Before leaving, she added one final challenge. The real Archmage Ashimon would never have acted as recklessly or boldly as the boy standing before her. As the two of them returned to the meeting hall, every eye in the room immediately turned toward them with intense curiosity. Clemens silently admitted to himself that he had grown too complacent. He had underestimated the political swamp he had stepped into. The nobles would never truly believe that a boy with no mana had survived through simple self-defense against the son of a powerful count. When the investigator asked about the contents of their private conversation, Clemens completely ignored the question. Instead, he walked toward a sword, resting against the wall. Gripping the hilt firmly, he slammed the blade into the floor with a violent crash that instantly silenced the room. The entire assembly stared at him in shock as he slowly turned toward Count Corwell. Then, in a cold and unwavering voice, he challenged the Count to prove his accusations immediately and settle the matter once and for all. Clemens invoked the ancient northern custom of trial by combat, a brutal duel where the victor would be declared innocent while the loser would forever bear the guilt. The Count stared at him in disbelief, wondering whether the boy had completely lost his mind. Trial by combat was an ancient and savage tradition with virtually no restrictions. But after a moment, the Count realized this challenge presented a perfect opportunity. If the matter shifted from the courtroom to the arena, he could erase both the evidence and the boy at the same time. A predatory smile spread across his face as he accepted the challenge and announced that he would appoint a champion to fight in his place. He openly swore that the boy would die. Clay merely smiled in response, completely unbothered, and calmly declared that he would personally bring an end to the Count's bloodline instead. With the duel scheduled 4 days later, Clay understood this was merely the beginning. He intended to use Count Corwell as a stepping stone to demonstrate to every parasite within the family exactly who he truly was. His goal was simple: tear the rotten house apart and rebuild it in his own image. Elsewhere, inside a private section of the manor, Clemens' older half-brother, Dalton, exploded in anger. He shouted that the challenge was complete insanity and demanded to know whether Clemens understood he was risking his life. Already exhausted from endless lectures, Clemens bluntly replied that he was fully aware and tired of hearing the same warnings repeatedly. Dalton explained that their father had already approved the duel, but desperately offered to take Clemens' place as the family's champion. Clemens refused immediately. Dalton argued that as the future ruler of the North, it was his responsibility to protect his younger brother. For the first time, his usual composure cracked. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Dalton recalled the first time he had seen Clemens as a baby. To him, the child had looked like a beautiful angel, and he confessed that he had spent 7 long years waiting for his younger brother to finally return from the monastery. Tears filled his eyes as he grabbed Clemens by the shoulders and begged him to reconsider, terrified that his brother was marching towards certain death. Their emotional exchange was suddenly interrupted when a guard rushed into the room carrying urgent news. Count Corwell had already selected his champion. Clemens gently pulled himself free from his brother's grip before coldly asking who his opponent would be. The guard revealed the name: Randall, an excommunicated knight infamous for his terrifying reputation on the battlefield. The scene then shifted to a filthy tavern where the doors violently swung open, revealing an enormous muscular man whose eyes radiated pure savagery. Randall had been expelled from the knightly orders because of his uncontrollable bloodlust and his obsession with slaughter. He sat among shattered furniture and unconscious bodies while drinking blood-red liquor straight from a wooden bucket, his face twisted into a monstrous expression of rage. With anticipation dripping from his voice, he muttered that it had been far too long since he had heard the screams of a young boy. Back at the manor, Clemens listened carefully to the description of his opponent, his expression gradually becoming serious and unwavering. At that moment, another man approached him while carrying a sword carefully wrapped in cloth. Handing the weapon over, he spoke with a solemn warning. "This is the sword you requested. I forged it exactly according to your instructions, but please be careful. The instant it collides with a mana-infused weapon, it will shatter." Clemens quietly accepted the sword and inspected it for a brief moment. Then, without the slightest hesitation, he calmly replied, "Good, then let's leave immediately." At the same time, excitement had already begun spreading throughout the arena. Everywhere people gathered, there was only one topic being discussed. Clemens had finally decided to appear in person. The entire arena buzzed with excitement and curiosity as countless spectators fixed their eyes upon the battlefield. The scene then shifted toward the nobles seated high above the arena grounds. One noble glanced toward Clemens' father with visible surprise and remarked, "I never expected you to personally appear here today." Then, with a faint smile, he continued, "But are you truly comfortable with this? My champion is an imperial knight. Your son doesn't even possess mana, so this could become troublesome for him." It's not too late to send Lord Dalton in his place instead, is it? Despite the provocation, Clean's father showed absolutely no reaction. His expression remained perfectly calm and unreadable, as though he had already accepted the outcome long ago. Meanwhile, Clean continued walking toward the center of the arena while quietly scanning his surroundings. Inside his mind, a single thought echoed. Where is my opponent? Why hasn't he appeared yet? But the very next moment, an enormous shadow suddenly towered over him. A gigantic man stepped forward. His body resembled solid steel, with monstrous muscles bulging beneath his clothes like a warrior born solely for battle. Slowly, the man rested a massive hand on top of Clean's head and looked down at him with a threatening grin. So, you're Lord Clean? The narration then revealed the identity of the terrifying figure before him. This man was none other than Count Corwell's chosen champion Randall. Randall stared down at Clean with a cruel smile before mockingly speaking once again. You're even younger than I expected. Good. His grin widened dangerously. Those skinny little arms of yours. I wonder what kind of scream you'll make when your neck snaps. The instant Clean sensed danger, he immediately leaped backward with astonishing speed, creating distance between them in a single fluid motion. The crowd was instantly stunned. Murmurs erupted throughout the arena. What was that? Did he just jump backward like that? Up in the noble stands, the same nobleman from earlier looked toward Clean's father again and laughed softly. Did you see that, Your Grace? The duel hasn't even started, and he's already trembling in fear. Can he really fight someone like Randall? Meanwhile, Randall let out a low chuckle before speaking again. Oh dear, he already looks terrified. But while Clean stared cautiously at his opponent, his thoughts were entirely different. It's not fear. Damn it, that startled me. It reminded me of when that priest grabbed my shoulder before. I moved away on instinct without even realizing it. That damned priest really is troublesome until the very end. At that same moment, high above the arena, Captain Leah Fervin silently observed everything unfolding below. Her sharp eyes remained fixed entirely on Clean as the tension within the arena continued to rise. Suddenly, one of her guards hurried over and spoke nervously. Lady Hellion will be furious if she learns about this. We should leave immediately, Captain. But Leah answered without even turning toward him. I don't care. That woman is not my mother. Then another thought quietly crossed her mind. If he actually defeats that knight, I'll give him my lips. Even after thinking that, her gaze never once left the arena. There's still something I need to confirm, she whispered softly to herself. Meanwhile, down below, Clean stood in the center of the battlefield while feeling the pressure of countless eyes watching him. Embarrassment slowly crept across his face. This is unbelievably embarrassing. Trying desperately to appear calm and dignified, he awkwardly straightened his posture before speaking. Well, you see, I've been suffering from a stiff neck lately. Then, with visible irritation in his voice, Clean added, So you better not touch my shoulder. Despite the warning, Randall slowly reached toward him once again, clearly provoking him on purpose. The moment Clean saw that hand moving closer, his expression immediately twisted with annoyance. I told you not to touch me, you perverted bastard. Are your ears filled with muscle too? Then he added mockingly, But I suppose that's exactly why the Empire threw you away. For one brief moment, the entire arena fell completely silent. Then Randall's face slowly stretched into a savage grin. Excellent, he muttered darkly. The filthier your mouth is now, the louder you'll scream later. The instant those words left his lips, Randall launched a devastating punch directly toward Clean. His enormous fist tore through the air with terrifying force, powerful enough to instantly crush an ordinary person. But at that exact moment, Clean calmly unbuttoned his coat. Then, boom! Randall's fist slammed directly into the arena floor with explosive force. The impact shattered the stone beneath him as cracks violently spread across the battlefield and clouds of dust erupted into the air. But Randall's eyes widened in surprise. The only thing left clenched in his hand was Clean's discarded coat. Clean himself had already vanished before the attack could connect. The audience instantly exploded into chaos. The ground shattered. What kind of strength is that? Wait, look over there. Everyone quickly turned toward the opposite side of the arena. Clean now stood at a distance with a short sword gripped tightly in his hand. His eyes remained locked cautiously on Randall. That bastard has an unbelievably bad temper. Inside his mind, Clean calmly analyzed the situation. A direct confrontation is going to be difficult, just as I expected. If even one hit from that monster lands on me, I'll be blown apart instantly. As much as I hate admitting it, this is not a fight where I can afford to hold back. Meanwhile, the spectators continued whispering nervously among themselves as they witnessed the overwhelming difference in raw strength between the two fighters. One man stared toward the battlefield and muttered anxiously. He dodged that attack pretty well, But how is he supposed to defeat a monster like that? Another spectator swallowed nervously before speaking in disbelief. If even one of those attacks grazes him, every bone in his body will shatter. Elsewhere in the crowd, worried voices continued spreading. He's practically walking toward his own death. Nearby, Clayne's friend called out his name, and at that moment, the words Clayne had spoken earlier resurfaced in his mind. You want to take my place in the trial by combat? That would only give them a legal excuse to kill the heir of the Rainland family. As those words echoed within him, he silently admitted to himself, "You're right, the fate of the family is at stake. I can't just act recklessly." But before that thought could fully settle, the battle on the arena floor suddenly intensified. Randall exploded forward with terrifying speed, instantly closing the gap between them. Clayne immediately drew his sword and counterattacked, but Randall casually caught the blade with his bare hand. The sheer force of that action stunned everyone watching. In the next instant, Randall launched a brutal counterattack that sent Clayne sliding backward across the arena floor. But Randall gave him no opportunity to recover. Moving with overwhelming speed, he appeared in front of Clayne once again and continued his relentless assault. While attacking, Randall sneered mockingly, "Do you seriously think you can win just by dodging?" Clayne used every ounce of strength he possessed merely to block the incoming blows. Each strike felt heavier than the last, forcing him farther and farther backward. Meanwhile, Randall continued mocking him mercilessly. "Why don't you use your necromancy already? Aren't you supposed to be the great Archmage?" But the moment Randall looked directly into Clayne's eyes, he suddenly noticed something strange. Clayne was smiling. It was not the smile of confidence or amusement. It was a smile filled with irritation and suppressed anger. Inside his mind, Clayne's thoughts darkened. This is getting annoying. Should I just use necromancy and kill every one of them? The instant that thought surfaced, Randall instinctively stepped backward. Cold sweat poured down his face as his body reacted before his mind could even understand what had frightened him. For the first time, the arrogance and confidence he had displayed throughout the battle began to crack. Confused murmurs immediately spread across the audience. What just happened? Why did Randall suddenly back away? No way, maybe he's just going easy on him. But Randall himself knew that was not the truth. Inside his mind, confusion swirled violently. What the hell was that just now? There was nothing there. And yet, despite Clayne not visibly doing anything, Randall could feel a suffocating aura of death radiating from him. It was invisible to the eye, but every instinct in his body screamed at him to stay away. That unseen pressure alone was enough to make fear crawl across his entire body. Watching Randall suddenly retreat, the noble seated above the arena clicked his tongue in frustration. What's going on with him? Why is Randall acting like that? At that moment, Clayne calmly stepped forward and addressed everyone in the arena. "Don't worry. I won't use necromancy." His voice remained steady as he continued, "Because I am a Rainland." Then, after a brief pause, he declared firmly, "This duel is meant to prove oneself through the sword alone. Therefore, I will not use necromancy." The moment those words left his mouth, shock spread throughout the entire arena. His father, his friends, and nearly every spectator stared at him in disbelief. No one had expected such a declaration. Until now, many people had viewed him with suspicion because of the rumors surrounding necromancy. But hearing those words spoken directly by Clayne slowly began changing the atmosphere entirely. Little by little, the crowd's attitude shifted. Then cheering gradually erupted from all sides of the arena. "Yes, that's what a true trial by combat should be. We're supporting you." So it wasn't just empty bravado after all. The arena, once filled with doubt and ridicule, slowly transformed into a place overflowing with excitement and support, all because of Clayne's unwavering declaration. Meanwhile, Randall poured even more mana into his sword. The weapon's aura grew sharper, heavier, and more dangerous as he prepared his next attack. Staring directly at Clayne, he muttered confidently, "That brat doesn't even have mana." At that moment, the true reason Imperial swordsmanship was feared throughout the Empire became clear. The strength of Imperial swordsmanship came from never restraining one's mana. By forcing every function of the body beyond its normal limits, breathing, muscles, blood, flow, reflexes, and senses, a swordsman could unleash explosive bursts of overwhelming power capable of instantly hunting down an opponent. Gathering all of his strength into a single devastating attack, Randall charged forward at incredible speed. His entire focus centered on ending the duel with one strike. But at that exact moment, Clayne calmly evaded the attack while carefully observing Randall's movements. Then, in a quiet voice, Clayne spoke. "I can see it. Your technique. Your mana capacity. Even the path of your blade. Every last detail. To Klain, Randall's attacks had begun looking painfully obvious as insignificant, predictable as a buzzing fly. Hearing those words only fueled Randall's rage further. Once again, he gathered every ounce of his power into another strike. This attack carried nearly twice the force of the previous one. The instant the attack struck, a massive explosion erupted across the arena. Dust and smoke burst outward violently, swallowing the entire battlefield and completely obscuring everyone's vision. The spectators could barely make out anything through the thick cloud created by the impact. Randall's eyes widened in disbelief. Did he really analyze every trajectory of my sword in such a short time? Then suddenly, from behind him, Klain appeared. Moving silently through the smoke, Klain slipped directly into Randall's blind spot and prepared to counterattack. With a body that large, your back is completely exposed. In the very next instant, Klain struck. His timing was absolutely flawless. The precision and fluidity of his swordsmanship were so extraordinary that everyone watching was left speechless. Even the veteran warriors in the arena struggled to believe what they had just witnessed. Meanwhile, Randall's mind descended into total confusion. This makes no sense. This bastard doesn't even have mana. So how the hell is he doing this? Not far away, one of the soldiers standing beside Leah Fervin spoke in complete disbelief. "Captain, did you just see that?" At that moment, even Leah herself had begun blushing slightly as she watched Klain fight. The skill, composure, and overwhelming confidence he displayed before the entire arena had clearly affected her. The scene then shifted elsewhere, where a heavy silence filled the room. Amidst that silence, a calm but frustrated voice finally spoke. Normally, I would have intervened myself. Before anyone else could respond, another man hurriedly interrupted. "Your Grace, that's..." But Klain's father cut him off immediately. "I know." His voice remained low and heavy. "I cannot allow personal emotions to cloud my judgment. If I interfere now, the prestige of the place, Rainland family, will only sink even lower." His expression darkened further as he continued. "But his opponent is an Imperial Knight. Klain has almost no chance of winning." The other man hesitated before cautiously asking, "Then, why did you permit the duel?" For a moment, Klain's father remained silent, as though carrying years of regret within his heart. Finally, he spoke. He stepped forward to defend the honor of his late mother. His voice trembled faintly with guilt. "When he was falsely branded as Ashaman and imprisoned inside that monastery, I couldn't save him." Slowly, his fists tightened. "So what right do I have to stop him now?" The atmosphere in the room became even heavier. "In the end," he continued bitterly, "I couldn't protect anything. Not my child, not my family." Hearing those painful words, the man beside him immediately tried to reassure him. "There's no need to worry, Your Grace. Young Master Klain never fights battles he believes he will lose." The scene then returned to the battlefield. The duel was still raging, yet even Klain's father could no longer hide the shock in his eyes. After witnessing what was unfolding before him, at that moment the narration began explaining the true nature of the Rainland family's swordsmanship. The Rainland family was known throughout the north as the family of northern swordsmanship. To survive the merciless frozen lands, they had developed a combat style that minimized mana consumption to the absolute limit. Every movement was designed for efficiency. Every strike conserved strength and mana so they could endure prolonged battles across the brutal icy wastelands. Imperial swordsmanship, however, followed the complete opposite philosophy. Imperial swordsmanship was pure domination. It relied on unleashing overwhelming amounts of mana all at once, crushing the opponent before they could even react. In contrast, Rainland's swordsmanship focused entirely on patience, precision, and waiting for the perfect opening while using the smallest amount of mana possible. That was the true essence of the Rainland family's techniques. Maximum efficiency with minimal mana expenditure. As this realization spread throughout the battlefield, Klain calmly faced Randall and spoke. "This is how someone without mana can still wield the techniques of the Rainland family." Despite the terrifying pressure pouring from his opponent, Klain's eyes never wavered. "It may lack raw power, but it's more than enough to defeat someone like you." The moment those words reached him, Randall's expression twisted with fury. Veins bulged across his face as he glared at Klain with murderous rage. "You little rat." At the same time, an overwhelming surge of power began gathering throughout Randall's entire body. Mana erupted around him violently, becoming denser and heavier with every passing second. It was obvious he intended to unleash every ounce of mana he possessed in one devastating strike. From above the arena, the noble observing the duel immediately recognized what was happening. His eyes widened. There it is, Randall's secret technique. A mana burst powerful enough to instantly seal the opponent's movements. The pressure across the battlefield continued rising without pause. Even the air itself felt unbearably heavy beneath Randall's growing power. Then, with a furious roar, Randall shouted, "Don't make me laugh, bastard. I'm the one who's going to win." In the next instant, he exploded forward at terrifying speed, crossing the distance between himself and Klein almost instantly. His attack crashed downward with monstrous force, powerful enough to crush his opponent in a single blow. But at the final possible moment, Klein reacted calmly. Without a hint of panic, he raised his sword with perfect timing and blocked Randall's attack head-on. However, everyone still remembered the warning that had been given before the duel began. The moment this sword collides with a mana-infused blade, it will shatter. And exactly as predicted, the instant Klein blocked Randall's mana-enhanced strike. Crack. Fractures spread across the blade instantly before the sword completely shattered apart. Broken fragments scattered through the air. Seeing this, Randall immediately smirked victoriously. "Serves you right. With this, your sword is but." Before he could even finish his sentence, Clen suddenly smiled. "Yeah," he said calmly. "Now it's finally complete. The weapon to hunt. You." For a brief moment, Randall could not understand what he meant. Then it happened. Clen's moved forward in an instant, instead of treating the shattered weapon as useless. He used the broken blade itself like a short manblade designed for close-range combat. Before Randall could properly react, Clen stepped directly into his range and slashed at point-blank distance. A sharp strike flashed through the battlefield. Randall's arm was cut clean off. The severed arm flew through the air as blood scattered everywhere, and Randall's expression twisted into complete shock and agony. He let out a horrifying scream as he collapsed backward. At that moment, someone loudly declared, "The duel is over." Meanwhile, among the people watching the fight, one man stared at the battlefield in disbelief while thinking to himself, just as the young master said, Rhineland swordsmanship can be performed with minimal mana, but that should only be possible for a seasoned knight. Yet, he flawlessly executed everything from the footwork to the path of the sword, and on top of that, he deliberately baited his opponent into breaking his sword so he could strike from point-blank range. The man could barely believe what he had witnessed. No matter how you look at it, this is the young master's perfect victory. On the battlefield, Randall continued screaming loudly in pain after losing his arm. Immediately, a group of healers rushed forward toward him in panic. "Hurry up and stop the bleeding. Quickly, hold his arm down, cast sleep magic." The entire area became chaotic as the healers desperately tried to stabilize him. Meanwhile, Cleans calmly watched the scene before, asking, "Can that be reattached?" However, despite his calm voice, he actually looked visibly disappointed. After hearing the severity of the injury, the healers quickly responded, "No, it only needs basic healing magic. We'll have to prepare a prosthetic arm." Hearing that answer, Cleanse simply replied, "Oh really? Is that all?" At the same time, deep inside his mind, he quietly thought to himself, even after 200 years, healing magic hasn't advanced much at all. Then, from the other side, his father called out to him with a serious expression, "You feel nothing after seeing a severed limb." The moment Clans heard those words, his expression slightly changed. "Right, I'm not Arjuman right now," he reminded himself internally. After that, Clans quietly began walking away from the scene as if everything had already ended. While moving forward calmly, as Klein walked away calmly, a thought crossed his mind. Should I pretend to look scared now? At that very moment, the true mastermind behind the entire incident finally stepped forward. His face twisted with disbelief and fury as he shouted, "This is impossible. Randall actually lost? Do you even realize how much money I spent to hire that knight?" Before he could continue his outburst, Klein's father suddenly spoke from behind in a cold, commanding voice. "Count Cornwell." The man immediately turned toward him. As agreed, Klein's father continued firmly. "Victor's demands. You will now admit your crimes and fulfill the..." Count Cornwell's face distorted with frustration and desperation. "I already lost my son and my finest knight. How am I supposed to?" But before he could finish speaking, something horrifying occurred. For a split second, it appeared as though his head had been severed cleanly from his body. The entire arena froze. Then the focus shifted to Klein's cold, emotionless eyes staring directly at him. Delkin Cornwell. A moment later, the horrifying illusion faded. Delkin Cornwell was still alive. His head had never actually been cut off. Trembling violently, He frantically grabbed at his neck over and over again, unable to comprehend what had just happened. It had merely been an illusion born from the overwhelming pressure of Clayne's power, but to Dalton, it had felt completely real. Inside his mind, panic exploded. What was that? My neck. It was definitely. Cold sweat poured down his face as fear consumed him entirely. Clayne slowly stepped forward and spoke in a chilling voice. As the victor of this duel, I command you. Confess your sins before the Lord of the North and kneel to beg forgiveness. His voice grew even heavier, as though death itself was speaking through him. Bow your head and plead for mercy, for you will be crushed beneath the weight of your sins and forced to repent. The moment those words reached Dalton Cornwell's ears, true terror swallowed him whole. It felt as though death itself was standing directly behind Clayne. His entire body trembled uncontrollably. Sweat dripped endlessly down his face, and even breathing became difficult. Unable to endure the fear any longer, he finally collapsed mentally. I was wrong, he stammered fearfully. My son and I attempted to harm young Master Clayne. At that moment, the narration revealed the truth behind the terrifying technique Clayne had used. It was originally a voice meant to summon the souls of the dead man's voice, a soul-corrupting ability exclusive to necromancers, a horrifying power capable of instilling overwhelming terror into the hearts of the living. Dalton Cornwell completely broke down before Clayne. Shaking uncontrollably, he fell to his knees and bowed his head deeply while begging for forgiveness. Furthermore, I insulted young Master Clayne's mother, Grand Duchess Claire. Please forgive me. The people witnessing the scene could hardly believe what they were seeing. One of the spectators stared in complete disbelief and muttered, Am I really witnessing this? To think that one of the pillars of the branch families would collapse like that. Meanwhile, Clayne slowly raised his shattered sword toward the sky. Even though the blade itself was broken, the pressure radiating from him felt heavier than ever before. Then, in front of every noble and knight gathered in the arena, he began to speak with unwavering confidence. Good. It begins here. His voice echoed powerfully across the battlefield. Everyone standing here today, listen carefully. This is my declaration to the world. The entire arena instantly fell silent. To restore this family to its rightful state, I stood as the challenger in this trial by combat, and I stand here now as its rightful victor. His gaze never wavered as he continued speaking proudly. I am the son of Grand Duchess Claire Ladalas, and the second son of the North's strongest knight, Hansel Rainland. Then, with absolute pride, he declared his name before the entire crowd. I am Clayne Rainland. After that powerful proclamation, the scene shifted to a completely different location. The atmosphere there was calm, heavy, and almost sacred. Inside a quiet hall, a priest could be heard praying softly. We shall walk where your light does not reach, even if the path is dangerous, even if it is painful. Please watch over our resolve, O God of light. At that moment, a man entered the hall and stepped forward. Cardinal Murrow. The priest slowly turned his head. Yes, Garrison. Your voice sounds troubled. What happened? Garrison's expression remained grim as he answered immediately. The surveillance target was attacked. The attackers were necromancers accompanied by undead creatures. For a brief moment, silence filled the hall. I need to personally verify this matter, Garrison added firmly. However, Cardinal Murrow showed no concern whatsoever. Instead, he calmly replied, There is no need to worry. Everything proceeded according to plan. He was dispatched in cooperation with the Empire. Garrison narrowed his eyes slightly. Cardinal Murrow continued speaking as though explaining something perfectly reasonable. A necromancer is naturally an existence that inspires fear. Those who fear them will inevitably seek salvation from God. Countless people will flock toward the Holy Order. Then his voice turned colder. Understand this, Garrison. If reviving the Holy Order and spreading God's influence requires only a handful of sacrifices. But before he could finish speaking, Garrison suddenly moved. In a single instant, he grabbed Cardinal Murrow by the throat with overwhelming force. His eyes burned with fury as he growled through clenched teeth. A servant of the Holy Temple has fallen so low that he conspires with heretics for political gain. The next moment, Garrison crushed the Cardinal's head with raw strength alone. Blood exploded across the hall as Murrow's lifeless body collapsed onto the floor. Then another voice echoed through the blood-stained chamber. Do you feel better now? A man slowly stepped forward, calmly walking through the carnage. He looked directly at Garrison before speaking in a mocking tone. You truly never change, Garrison Vermin. To think you've killed more clergymen than the necromancers themselves. A faint smile formed on his face as he continued. The people of the Holy Order would probably be quite interested to learn what's hidden inside that heart of yours. The narration then revealed the man's identity. He was Archbishop Palamon L. Garrison glared at him coldly. "Was this your doing, Palamon?" Palamon answered immediately without hesitation. "Of course not. I merely approved it." Then his expression turned more serious. "Besides, I came here because I discovered something regarding your surveillance target." The moment those words were spoken, Garrison instantly attacked. His fist shot forward with enough force to kill an ordinary man instantly. But Palamon moved far faster than any normal human. Before Garrison could even process what happened, Palamon had already vanished from his original position and reappeared elsewhere effortlessly. As though nothing had happened, Palamon continued speaking calmly. "Necromancy always leaves traces behind." He raised a strange cross-shaped artifact while explaining. "This cross contains the residual traces left behind by the necromancer you killed." Garrison's expression hardened as he listened carefully. "One of the traces belongs to soul-returning arts," Palamon explained. "A form of necromancy that resurrects corpses, the very same field the Empire is currently researching." Then his tone lowered slightly. "But the second trace is entirely different. It resembles the original form of necromancy, the kind that manipulates souls instead of corpses." Garrison immediately reacted. "The original form of necromancy?" "Yes," Palamon answered calmly. The atmosphere instantly grew heavier. "That means there were two necromancers present at the scene." Then Palamon looked directly into Garrison's eyes and spoke slowly, making sure every word carried weight. "Listen carefully, Garrison. Your surveillance target, the second son of the Rainland family." A brief silence followed,